Hey guys, I know you're going to be excited about this podcast episode. This is Philip Yancey. If you're unfamiliar with him, you're about to be excited. You're in for a treat. He is an award winning author, renowned theologian, and influential speaker who has touched the hearts of millions with his 13 gold medallion award winning books and won 2 Book of the Year awards for What's So Amazing About Grace and the Jesus I Never Knew. And I'm so excited to chat with him today about his re-release revised edition of What's So Amazing About Grace. Welcome to the podcast, good sir.
Thank you very much, Katie.
Yes, I'm so excited. Thank you for, first of all, writing this book way back when and going back and brushing it up, doing what you're doing to it, and re-releasing it for a new generation who may not have known and needs these precious words in their hands, in their minds.
Can you believe it? 25 years on, we're still in need of grace in this world.
Right?
Maybe more than now than ever.
I agree. And I love just the word grace and how you unpack that. But before I get ahead of myself, I wanted to share real quick. I became a Christian in 2002. And one of the first books recommended to me, More Than Just a Carpenter, which I'm sure you probably heard of.
Yes.
And What Is So Amazing About Grace. And those are just my first. I grew up in we would say Christian and put parentheses around it because we grew up in the South, but there was no meat to my faith. And reading those 2 books just really set me up for, I believe, a really good success in my faith and to be able to seek the Lord in the right way and not have this false junk that we have. So anyway, I just want to tell you that as a baby Christian when I was back in the day, thank you so much for that.
Oh, that's great. And now you're spreading the word all over the place. Thank you.
I'm trying. But I want to go ahead and unpack your book and all of that good stuff. And so first, just tell me why now? Why 25 years? Why are we need it, but I'm just thankful that and want to know why you decided to revisit it now.
Mainly because the world has gotten more divided and hostile in the last 25 years. I went back and kind of put myself back in those days. And the biggest news on newspaper headlines was about Bill Clinton and a White House intern. I mean, that was the biggest thing. The Cold War had fallen apart. Communism had collapsed. Countries were becoming free for the first time all over Eastern Europe. Places like South Africa, there was a peaceful changeover of government. And it looked like the world was kind of getting its act together. So much so that one historian, Francis Fukuyama, said, it's the end of history. We've decided liberal democracies have won, and now everybody wants one. Well, flash forward 25 years, we got a war going on in Ukraine. There's more hostility and more oppression, really, in China. And liberal democracies are kind of on the wane. And even in our own country, the divisions between Republicans and Democrats are very wide. I wouldn't say wider now than ever, because we did have a civil war, as you know, but pretty divided. And in those kind of circumstances, we really need grace on both sides.
Amen and amen. At the very beginning of the book, you talk about just the word grace being the last great word. I think it was what you said. And I love that. And how, was it charity has even been, misconfused and people say, oh, I don't want your charity. But this beautiful word grace being the last great word. I'd love for you to unpack that for a minute.
Yeah, you're right. A lot of these words that used to mean one thing, later kind of the word is pejorate. They get worse over time. And grace is an exception. It's actually used all the time. You get a good service at a restaurant, so you leave a gratuity. You're playing the piano or guitar or something, and there are these grace notes. And you can play the tune without them, but it just adds a little bit more if you insert some of those grace notes. My favorite experience with that is when I was stuck in traffic one time in Los Angeles. You hear about Los Angeles traffic, and I had a Hertz rental car. And I knew I was going to be late, and I showed up, and I was about an hour late, and I was prepared for them to charge me for a whole nother day. So I was kind of irritated and put my keys down, and she said, well, that's it. I said, well, don't I owe you more? I'm a little late. She said, oh, well, Mr. Yancey, we have a grace note, a grace period here for 1 hour. You're not charged. I said, well, oh, that's interesting. What is grace? And I don't think they covered that in the Hertz training manual because she said, Well, I don't know, but I guess it means that even though you're supposed to pay for something, you don't have to. That's a pretty good start, actually.
Yeah.
Theologically, that's a pretty decent start in understanding this concept of grace that Jesus talked around and about through his stories, through his teaching in so many ways.
Yes, yes, and it is, and it's amazing. And I'm thankful that you're just diving into it. Um, I'm curious, in what ways do you think that like the revised edition will resonate with readers today? As you know, most of our readers are in their 20s, and I, I would say specifically, I travel to different colleges, so I get to talk to a lot of young people, and I
Mm,
think what I see from Gen Z is this hunger and I don't want to do it the way it's always been done, which is beautiful in a lot of ways.
right.
But also there's this the grace that was modeled by Jesus 2000 years ago is still beautiful today. So anyway, I guess maybe just talking specifically as it relates to the revised edition and what readers might pick up. Yeah, just
Mm.
some different things that they might pick up through that.
Well, I really did want to make the content of the book accessible to a whole new generation. So we actually got some millennials and other generations to read it and just tell me things that they didn't relate to or things they didn't understand. Even something like I refer to the breakup of Yugoslavia. And people said, well, what's Yugoslavia? I've never heard of that, you know.
Wow.
So it's easy to talk about Russia and Ukraine or some other examples, but the core of grace remains the same. And I think you're right. We need to learn from younger generations. The older generations tend to have very clear ideas about what's right, what's wrong, and then kind of a judgmental attitude toward those people who are on a different side of
Yeah.
issues, especially like gender issues, gay issues, those kind of things. The younger generation comes along and they're not quite sure what their position is, but they are quite sure what their attitude should be toward those people. And that was what struck me so much about Jesus, that the people who are most attracted to him were the people who are least like him. And
Yes.
Jesus did not have this little ranking deal, spiritual, less spiritual, outcast. In fact, he turned everything upside down. So it was the prostitutes, the tax collectors, the sinners who were attracted to him. And it was the uptight, righteous people, the Pharisees, who indeed were righteous people. They made sure they kept all the laws. But in Jesus' story, he said, you're so spiritual, you tithe your kitchen spices, salt, pepper, give 10% to God, but you've missed the whole message. It's a message of grace that goes to the sinner,
Yeah.
anyone who holds out their hand. His parables show that, his stories. And that's something that we can learn from the younger generation because, as I say, some of these issues, they haven't decided the rightness or wrongness, but they have decided the rightness of how to treat people that you aren't sure about or that you see differently. And that's where grace is put to the test.
You're absolutely right. And I love how in the book you kind of weave in stories of, the very beginning, how you mentioned the prostitute coming to you for help. And you're like, well, have you tried church? And she's like, why would I go there? And how, as you said, Jesus, and he would be like, come to me.
Mm.
And the church is somehow, largely speaking, and I think that a lot of churches are getting this right, but there's a disconnect, as you said. But anyways, I was hoping that maybe you could just share a story that stands out to you as the picture of grace, as you wove in so many. Maybe the one stands out that just pictures that beautiful essence of grace as we're trying to encapsulate here.
Yeah. Probably the one story I tell in the book that has received the most kind of emotional response is a story it's not my story, it's Jesus' story. It's the story of the prodigal son. But I update it in modern lingo. I do that with several of Jesus' parables. I've just got to say, I've tried to write parables. It's a really hard thing to do. And to imagine Jesus just spinning off one after another. Somebody asks her a question. Oh, well, that reminds me. And they tell, brilliant creative mind. And so in the story of the parables, prodigal son, we all know that story. I don't need to retell it. But in this case, it's a young girl in Traverse City, Michigan, who wants to explore the world. And she ends up being addicted to drugs and kind of run by a pimp in downtown Detroit. And she thinks she's seen her picture on a milk bottle where her parents have turned her in, and have you seen this child? And she figures there's just no way they're going to accept me back. And she takes that long bus ride. She leaves a message on their answering machine, but she never gets to talk to them. And she finally stops at the bus station, and there they are. I won't spoil the story for you, but that one just touches people's heart, because we all want that. We want that acceptance. Every one of us does some really bad things. We just mess up sometimes, and we need grace. We need forgiveness. We need not to be judged by that. And I'm so impressed with Jesus, how he reaches out to people. I mean, you think of the people in the New Testament. Think of Peter. Peter was always sticking his foot in his mouth and judging other people, and looking down on Judas. And then one day when he was against the wall, Peter was just like Judas, really. He denied Jesus 3 times. I never knew the blankety blank. And Jesus so gently kind of brought him back in. Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? That's what counts. And look at Paul. Paul was a torturer of Christians. That's what he did. He was a human rights abuser. And God deliberately chose those people so that none of us can say, oh, I'm useless now. God would never want somebody like me. Look at the people that God redeemed in the Bible. Look at the people that Jesus chose. It should give us hope that there's never a slammed door to grace. God's grace is always there.
I just got chills, and I think that can't be overshared, because again, when I was this Christian and label only teenager, young adult, I would have told you, oh, the Bible, obviously I had never read it, but I would have told you the Bible was a bunch of perfect people, and here's how to do like them. That was my interpretation. Yeah.
Yeah, and even now, if you ask people, what is a Christian, or what is an evangelical Christian? Well, these days they kind of will talk politics, which has nothing to do with what is a Christian. But if you ask them, no, really, what do you think are Christians? So they'll use words like, well, they're good people, or sometimes they'll say they're judgmental, or they're hypocrites, or holier than thou. It's always on that how well are they behaving scale. That's what people come up with. And that's why grace is so hard for people to understand, because we are one of those ranking societies. You rank your social class, your race, how much money you make, what school you went to, all that kind of stuff. And grace, again, turns all that upside down, so that when Jesus comes across a Pharisee, a religious teacher, and an outright sinner over here, and they're both praying, this guy prays, oh, sure, I'm glad I'm not like that guy over there. This guy prays, I'm a mess, help me. Which prayer does God listen to? And that paradox is true in so many of Jesus' stories, like the prodigal son.
Yeah.
You got one obedient, do as he's told, honor the family reputation son, but he's not the hero of that story.
Right.
It's the prodigal. It's the one who trashes the family's reputation and squanders their money.
Which is what's so amazing about grace.
Yeah, there you go.
Somebody should write a book on that.
I'll try.
As I said, I was so excited about getting this time with you, and I mentioned it to a friend I have who's on church staff, and so anyway, she's like, "Oh, if I could, interview Philip, Mr. Yancey, this is a few questions I would ask him," and so I have some surprise questions for you. I think you'll do great. Don't worry. This was, I thought, a really good question. It says, sometimes we show grace much easier to others than we do ourselves, and as we know, like this beating up ourselves kind of thing. And I bet. Well, I guess I'm curious if giving grace to yourself maybe reflects how you treat others. But anyway, I'm just curious your thoughts on that. If you've done any, research or found any anecdotal evidence of treating ourselves with grace versus treating others.
Well, it is very significant that when Jesus talks, he says, love your neighbor as you love yourself. That's pretty clear right there. And most of us, we do have a hard time receiving. We have a hard time receiving a gift free of charge. One time I was called, Katie, one of the most unusual speaking opportunities I've had. I was called to speak to 100 prostitutes. They were actually people who were caught up in sexual trafficking, had been ministered to by missions around the world, and they were brought together in Wisconsin for a week-long conference. And they asked me to come and speak about grace. And they say they have such a hard time receiving grace because they've been dumped on all their lives. You're worthless. As one of them said, nobody ever says, "Honey," to their daughter, "Honey, when you grow up, I want you to be the best prostitute in this town." It just
Right.
doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And I told them some stories about grace. I just said, Jesus talked about you guys. He talked about prostitutes. Let me tell you some of the things he said, and they were just astonished. And they did have a hard time receiving grace, but one of them finally summarized it. She said she was from Bulgaria, and she spoke with a strict accent. And she said, "Sometime you are at the low, and when you at the low, you cry help."
Mm.
And I thought that's a pretty good place. I like to quote Henry Nouwen, the author and psychologist, who said, "Grace is absolutely free. There's nothing you can do to earn it, to get God to like you more. But to receive a gift, you got to have your hands out.
Mm.
And when you're at the low, as this prostitute said, sometimes you'll cry for help. You'll have your hands out. It's really the uptight people who think they have it all together, who are looking down on other people who have their hands clenched tight in a fist. And when you do that, you don't receive the gift. It just falls to the ground. And so I've learned a lot. I imagine some of your listeners are involved in the recovery movement. And I've learned a lot from friends who do that. And you can't get anywhere unless you get past that first step, which is acknowledging I can't do it on my own. I need help. And that's so hard for us.
Yeah.
We don't like to admit that. We're Americans. We pull ourselves by our bootstraps. We're independent. But when you do that, you put up a wall and you close your fist against grace.
Oh, yes. I'm just like, so many things I want to say. That thank you. That was so good. I wrote down, I can't do it on my own. I remember that was my very first prayer in my
Mm-hmm.
college apartment. Like, I can't, I've tried to do it all, the what the world says, and I've chased all the boys and Bacardi and attempts to be beautiful and all the things the world says is it, and it's not. And I was like, I can't do this on my own. And I think that there's so much beauty in that simple surrender of like, I just can't. And then that's when grace comes in, as you said, that open fist. Like, that's such a beautiful picture. And how can we receive it if we're like, nope, I got it all figured out?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And
So
we tend to repeat that pattern over again. In Jesus' day, it was the Pharisees and the tax collectors. Now, tax collectors don't have that bad reputation so much as in his day, where they were working for the oppressive Roman Empire and fleecing the Jews. But we have our own versions. Go back to that story the book opens with. The woman, when you suggested going to church, I'm already feeling terrible about myself. They're just going to make me feel worse. And when I talk to people about church, they say, "Oh, well, I'm not good enough for that. I don't know how to dress." They wouldn't accept somebody like me. And that's actually true of some churches, and it's to our shame. We confuse grace with respectability.
yeah,
And grace is not about respectability, quite the contrary.
yeah. I've heard it said, don't judge Jesus based on our Christians.
Very good.
Yeah, and it's a shame because I know a lot of amazing, beautiful Christians, and not to say, certainly I hope that I'm not, an example of Jesus in a poor way, and I hope that a lot of people are doing. We're all going to fall short, of course,
Mm.
but yeah, I guess I just don't want anyone to, as we mentioned in the book, the chapter opener, the prostitute, not to go to church because of Christians, because Jesus, he is the giver of grace in low, copious amounts.
Good look.
Okay, the other question that was given to me by my friend, it says grace versus truth. It's not an easy proposition, and maybe just any insight or balance that you can give. And I know it feels like a loaded question, but this is tricky, especially when it comes to people that you love that might be prodigal son or living a lifestyle that you just know is not serving them or whatever it may be. Yeah, this grace versus truth. Like, where do you land? And case by case, I don't know, maybe give me the insight you might have for that.
Yeah. Overall, I have a comment to make about the church as a whole, and I'll get a little more personal. But that dichotomy, as it were, comes from John, who says about Jesus that he came full of grace and truth.
Mm.
And I look at followers of Jesus, the church that grew out of that, and it seems to me we've worked really hard on that truth angle. You know, by the third century, there were already these giant church councils that would get together, and then there'd be a split between this branch of the Orthodox and that branch, and then the Catholics, and then the Protestants, and now, last I heard, there are 45,000 denominations, and a lot
What?
of 45 around the world, and a lot of them have their own creed. You know, they've worked on their statement of faith, and there's nothing wrong with that, with caring about truth. That's important. So we all do that. But I just wish some churches would spend equal amounts of energy dispensing grace, you know, to come across. I'm going to compete to be the most grace-filled church in Chattanooga or Nashville or Denver, where I live. What a great goal. That would
Yeah.
be a great goal. In fact, there's a church here in Denver. The name of it is Scum of the Earth. Scum of the Earth. They get that, you know, kind of that turned upside down thing, so that anybody's welcome here. You don't have to dress up. You don't have to get your
I love
life
that.
together. So when you are in a position of authority, for example, you're hiring somebody on your church staff, or you're the parent of a child, obviously you have to balance that grace and truth. You have to speak truth, but then respond with grace even when the person breaks it. But for most of us, I think the message from Jesus is concentrate on the log in your own eye before you start looking at the splinter in somebody else's eye. You know, forgive others and deal with your own problems. You know?
Yeah.
And I think that's what we need to do, because when I ask people and they what is a Christian, and they say things like holier than thou or hypocritical, they just see Christians as maybe morally superior. Maybe they would even admit that, but not fun to be around because they're looking down on you. And again, here's Jesus, a perfect person who did no wrong, and yet when people were around him, even people who had really screwed up their lives, their reaction was, "I want what he's got."
Yes.
What's he drinking? I want some of that. And you know, Jesus said, "Yeah, I've got living water. Would you like some?" And he said that to a woman who had 5 failed marriages and was kind of in the wrong race in that culture. And Jesus was a grace dispenser. He didn't make you sign a doctrinal statement before you could belong to his group. In fact, look at the people he chose. One was a tax collector at the bottom of the social ladder. One was a zealot, kind of a terrorist, espousing violence in his day. And then one, of course, turned out to be a traitor. So Jesus took risks with grace. There's no doubt about it.
You shouted out my girl, the woman at the well.
Mm.
That's a story that changed my life. So have to
Mm.
give her a shout out. Love her. The living water. And I went I referenced my first prayer. God, I can't do it on my own. And I had just heard the woman at the well story, and I share the story anytime I get a chance. But anyways, I said, if living water exists, I want a keg of it.
I want a cake. And what I love about that story, Katie, is she is actually the only person, or at least the first person in the Gospels, to whom Jesus voluntarily revealed himself. I am the Messiah. You know, you kind of, when other people would say it, he said, "Well, don't tell anybody, you know,
Yeah.
let's keep that secret." But here is this woman that, in a sense, his first missionary. Who would Jesus choose as his first missionary? He chose a person of the wrong race with a very unsavory reputation. And he had good choice, because John tells us she went back to her village and converted the whole town. You know,
Yes.
and I think, this woman wouldn't be allowed into any Christian college I know. Wouldn't be allowed to
Yeah.
serve on a church staff. But Jesus knew better.
Mm.
You can't get beyond the power of redemption.
You're giving me all the feels. I had a good pastor friend advise me one time. I speak to colleges, and when I go to different colleges, my message isn't necessarily a Christian message. I'm just talking about sorority women and how they can make a change for good. Anyways, and I was like, oh, I really want to be a Christian speaker, and he told me they're not offering me the chance to go speak to 400 sorority girls. Like you. And it's so crazy. Like, I never would have picked me to do that, but you're right. Like God always, he consistently picks the most unlikely.
Yeah.
It blows my mind, and I can't talk
Yeah.
about it enough. It's the coolest thing.
Right. King David, they go through this whole list of these big strapping sons of Jesse, and well, don't you have anybody else? Yeah, there's this one runt out there taking care of the sheep. I want to see him. It's all the way through.
I know. I hope if you're listening and you didn't know about that, read your Bible because it's just it's the coolest thing. Okay, your last impromptu question. What are some important things that you've changed your no, wait, I'm sorry. Wait, that is it. Okay. What are some important things you may have changed your mind on concerning faith over the years? Deep one.
Changed my mind.
I know.
Yeah, I guess I would say I was alive in the early days when Christians started getting enamored with politics. The moral majority came along. There were people like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson, and they were bringing up important issues. Abortion, homosexuality. These are important issues. And then after a while, evangelicals as a movement became identified with those two issues more than any other two. And it is tempting, especially when you want your values. Well, let's get in some people who share those values in Congress, and they can vote laws and enforce them that way. But then I stepped back one day and I thought, isn't that strange? Jesus didn't say a word about abortion or a word about homosexuality. I think if you had asked him a question, he would have given you an answer. But he didn't go around saying, this is who we are.
Right.
In fact, he didn't even mention either one. And I thought, well, that's strange to be identified by something that Jesus didn't even mention, and we're Jesus followers. And again, those are important issues. I'm sure Jesus did have a strong opinion, but not to trump it around, because what often happens if you're known by that, then you start playing the rules of politics, and it's an adversary sport. So you start screaming at the people who disagree with you, and we've seen this happen over the last 20, 30 years, and it just keeps getting worse in a way. And that's one reason, one thing I suppose that I've changed about, because it did seem tempting. And I grew up in a place where Christians were a minority, and it's kind of fun to see your name in the papers or whatever. And Christians were feeling good about that. They're finally getting some recognition. I mean, these guys, Falwell and Robertson, are on TV every day, so they're household names. And a magazine said, this is the year of the evangelical. It was on the cover of Newsweek magazine. And boy, that's tempting. But right now we're seeing kind of the dark side of that temptation, where we've split so much that we no longer see the other side as human beings needing grace, and ourselves as human beings needing grace, but we start judging them by the rightness or wrongness of your position.
Yes, I think you're 100% right. And it all, usually the issues are in these polar opposites, right? When the pendulum is so far one way, and often in this messy middle, as I like to call it, is where Jesus says, hey, you prostitute, let's have a conversation. Hey, you woman at the well from the wrong side of the tracks. I'm the Messiah. Nobody knows it yet. He's just, he's a pretty cool dude. Yeah. Let me just go back on script a little bit. I am curious, with this beautiful book that you've kind of re-looked at and stuff like that, how are you hoping that the revised edition will continue to impact readers as a society, and just giving it fresh breath? By the way, I looked at some of your reviews. This is really a life-changing book. I mean, I don't want to be dramatic, but it really is. And I'm just so thankful that it's getting fresh life. But anyways, sorry, back to my question.
Yes, I don't want there to be a barrier. That's why I wanted to update. I wanted people, as they read, to think, this is about my world. This is about my life. And if you're reading something that refers to stuff that took place 30 years ago and you can't even remember it, then it creates a little barrier, creates some distance. And I'm trying to make it as personal as possible. We added reflection questions, especially to be studied together in a small group, and there's actually a video curriculum on the book. I like that, because grace grace involves things like families. I know about this. I've got a family of 3 people, or I did. My mother died this year, so it was the mother and 2 sons. She was a widow. My mother and brother hadn't spoken in 50 years before she died. And I did get them together on a telephone conversation a few times right before she died. But that's 50 years when they never heard each other's voice. Why? And when you ask that in a group, it's amazing the stories that will come out. People will just unburden themselves. And it's a good thing to do when you've got a community of supporters around you. So I want that to happen too. So we built a reflection guide directly into the book so that you don't have to go out and buy some separate study guide or something. It's right there. And there are other things online that you can get to fill it in. But I want it to be about the real world that we face every day, not this people walking around in bathrobes and sandals back in Jesus' day, Yeah. But let's take those people, let's take that teaching and apply it to our lives. And we are all grace starved. I'm convinced of that.
Yeah.
And it doesn't take a lot to pluck that chord of response so that a person says, yeah, that's what I need. Yeah, I'm failing there. That's what I hope continues over the next few generations.
I think that it will. And as I mentioned, the reviews, just how, it's really just been so impactful for so many people. I know that you've heard stories more than just mine of, reading this as a baby Christian. Are there any testimonies that stand out to you of people who have gotten their hands on the book and just had some really, really cool life changes or testimonies or things like that? I'd love to hear about it.
Yeah, just the other day, I ran into a story. I was going to a city to speak. And in my book, I talked about a woman who was a mother, and her 3-year-old child was having brain surgery as she was writing the letter. She was sitting in the lobby of a hospital, and she just poured herself out. It was 26 pages, Katie, 26-page letter that she wrote. The surgery was like 7-hour surgery. She had a lot of time. And I just got an email from the daughter. She's now an adult, and she had just graduated from seminary. And she said, remember when you wrote about me? I was that little girl whose mother wrote a 26-page letter. Let me tell you what's happened since. Wow. And she's been up and down health-wise, but then she had what she believes is a kind of healing. And she's just writing in gratitude. There's that word again, gratitude. What do you do when something really good happens? That's what grace is. And I try to bring out those experiences that I have when I climb the mountains of Colorado, or just these touches of beauty that strike us, or touches of unexpected forgiveness or love, and encourage people not just to be receivers of them, but dispensers of them. That's what we should be known as. We're the grace dispensers in the world. It's a tough world out there. And we know how Jesus acted. So let's act more like Jesus.
Grace dispensers. I'm writing that down as well. I'm picturing myself as a little Pez dispenser. Grace.
Yeah, right. No, I think of it as on tap. That keg you were talking about. Living water on tap.
I am here for it.
Okay.
I love it. Well, what a pleasure. I mean, I think that we covered all the good stuff. Obviously, I think that it's amazing that you also have questions in the back of this book. This is great for people to do a small group Bible study. I know a lot of sororities get together and do Bible studies. Whatever the case may be, even if it's you're sitting by yourself and reading this, I highly recommend it. And if one more person can become a grace dispenser from listening to this, then we'll live in a much better world. So yeah, thank you for sharing all of this amazingness and doing your due diligence to give the book new life. I'm so thankful.
All right. Well, delighted to be with you and get to know you a bit, Katie. I read your story online, and you have experienced grace, and now you are dispensing it to others.
Amen, brother. Thank you so much.
Okay.